We're going to get started. We're going to do Book of Daniel. It's week 4. We're going to move from the history into the mystery and start talking about chapter 7 and beyond. But first, last week we left off having read chapters 2 and 4, and those are chapters in which Daniel interprets 2 different dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar. And I gave you a short assignment to do this week, which was read chapter 5, think about what you noticed, what themes did you see, how's it relate to the book, what questions do you have, those sorts of things. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and that way we'll be able to talk through some of these things. So chapter 5 recap, that was your assignment for the week. And we'll work through that a little, but you read chapter 5. Who's willing to give us a brief outline of the things that happen in that chapter? You don't have to be exact, but walk us through the story a little bit. Who can tell us what happened? Or who's willing? I know all of you can. I just want to know who will, because otherwise we've got Haley the intern on, and she'll do it for us.
John? Yes. Kim Playhardy here.
All right, Kim.
Okay, so we've moved to Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Belshazzar.
Yeah.
Now the king. He's throwing a big banquet for 1,000 people. And in the middle of the banquet, he asks to have the gold and silver goblets from the Temple of Jerusalem brought in for them to use for their wine that they drink out of. And after that, he sees a human hand or fingers come out and write on a wall, which would turn him pale, which would turn me pale.
Yeah.
Can't figure out what it means. His wise men can't figure out what it means. And the queen summons Daniel. Daniel, she reminds him, was the wisest of all and helped Nebuchadnezzar interpret his dreams and everything. So the king summons Daniel, who recounts what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, how he was great and God made him great and sovereign. And then Nebuchadnezzar forgot his place and he was humbled and, like we talked about last week, became like an animal, and until he recognized that the Most High God was God. And Daniel reminds or tells Belshazzar that he hasn't recognized God, I guess. So he's humbled, and he interprets the writing on the wall as, and I won't get this exactly right, but your days are numbered, your reign is numbered, you've been weighed and found wanting, and your kingdom's going to be divided.
Yeah.
And the king rewards Daniel and puts on the purple robe and gold necklace around his neck and elevates him to a position 3rd highest in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar is slain.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Kim. So it's interesting, it was really hard to do a surprise attack on an ancient city. So the fact that Belshazzar is defeated that very night by Darius the Mede, makes me think that they knew they were on the way out, and they were having this kind of last hurrah, bring out the good china, bring out the vessels that we stole from the Israelites, and we'll use them before Darius defeats the whole city. It doesn't say that, but I always read it like that. So what else? Yeah, this is, you certainly saw it, but the phrases that we use today, the writings on the wall, and your days are numbered, those come right from the book of Daniel. And so they sort of have some biblical origin that we maybe don't think about very often. So what else did you notice? Or let's work through some of these questions. Doesn't have to be in order, doesn't have to be all of them. But what did you notice? What major themes did you see in the chapter? What questions came up for you? Basically, like, let's do a little reflecting. Whoever has something to share with the group. Go ahead and raise your hand, and I can call on you, or just unmute yourself and start talking if nobody is.
Well, I noticed that this is Ann Tornios, that is kind of similar to the other stories, that the astrologers and mystics and everyone couldn't interpret what was going on. Mm-hmm. So again, Daniel was able to do this because of his gift from God.
Yep, that's good, Ann. That's right on. Kathy and George, I see your hands up.
I think the book paints a very depressing picture of the court of the Babylonians. Belshazzar has blown off all the changes his father has made in favor of the God of the Jews. Either he had a poor relationship with his father, Nebuchadnezzar, or his grandfather, it depends on who you talk to, or simply wasn't guided by him. And remember that Nebuchadnezzar himself, blew hot and cold, swung from one extreme to another, probably not very trustworthy to his family. So I don't get a very good picture of continuity here, like the sons being better than the fathers. I get the feeling that he's degraded. Belshazzar has a lower, more materialistic notion of divinity than his father. In other words, he prays to gods of irons and stone, etc., not even major gods, much less a monotheistic God. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar was at least brought to understand the difference between an idol and, via his dream about the idol and the real God. And he was able to change his mind about it. But Belshazzar seems to have just ignored it or blown it all off. And so that's all.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Kathy. Ted and Gabriel, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Ted Pate. One of the things that I find interesting is that every time Daniel interprets a dream, he gets rewarded, even though almost every time what he's telling the king is not good news for the king. Yeah. It's bad news, but he gets rewarded for it.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good catch. That's exactly right. And it's very interesting, so I guess the message maybe is tell the truth, right?
Yeah, that's right. Tell the truth.
Yeah. He's got no other option.
God will reward you.
Good. Thanks, Ted. Anybody else have some reflection from chapter 5?
It's interesting that sometimes they're referred to as Babylonians and sometimes as Chaldeans.
Yeah. So tonight we're gonna work through chapter 7. In our first session, I talked about how chapter 7 is. In our first section, I talked about how the book of Daniel is basically split into two. The first half of the book tells these heroic tales of Daniel and his friends. That's chapters 1, 3, and 6, and Daniel's work in the king's court, interpreting dreams, Daniel 2, 4, and 5. And chapter 7 is a turning point in the book. In the first half if the first half of the book tells stories of these things that have happened, like the fiery furnace and the lion's den and interpreting dreams for the kings, the second half of the book tells of Daniel's vision for the future, or his visions of the future. And it turns out, actually, that the basic message of the second half of the book is the same basic message as the first half of the book, which is that God is in control, despite any appearance to the contrary. But instead of that being illustrated on the ground with those stories of God providing for Daniel and his friends in these difficult circumstances in their particular time and place, these last 6 chapters of the book are going to illustrate this idea that God is sovereign, not just among God's faithful people in actions of the past, but on this cosmic scale for all of eternity. So it's almost like we're zooming out and we can see a picture of all of creation and all of the cosmos and all of eternity, and we start to see not just things happening on earth, but this connection between earth and heaven, and even the battle between evil and the heavenly powers. As a reminder, these chapters fall into a category of writing called apocalyptic literature. It's a type of writing in which a human, in this case Daniel, receives divine revelation. But it's not in a straightforward way where God says, do this, not that, here's what you need to know, here's what the future holds. Instead, apocalyptic revelations are visions or dreams that are full of strange, mysterious creatures or symbols or happenings that require some sort of prayerful interpretation. And as a result, apocalyptic literature is metaphor rich. It's full of simile, and it's like poetry in some ways. And what that means on a very practical level, I think, is that it doesn't try to explain what's happening exactly so much as it's trying to teach us by analogy, and thus shed some light on difficult concepts by relating them to something we know from common experience. So here are 2 things to keep in mind that will help you, I think, as we read apocalyptic literature here in Daniel, or as you read it in the book of Revelation, the other place where this type of writing shows up in the Bible. So first thing to really kind of keep in mind is that apocalyptic literature, with all its imagery, symbolism, simile, and metaphor, is true and accurate, but not precise, right? So it's trying to tell the story truly and accurately, but not precisely. And there's 2 ways that this shows up. Sometimes it's because we don't know where the analogy stops. An analogy or a metaphor, we know, can powerfully illustrate something, but every analogy breaks down after a while. Every metaphor breaks down after a while. It can only illustrate so much. And part of our challenge then as readers is understanding how far to take that metaphor, how far to take that image. The other way that this type of writing speaks truly and accurately, but not precisely, especially in the book of Daniel and Revelation, has to do with time and timing. So for example, in chapter 7, we're going to encounter these beasts. And then in verse 12, it says that their dominion was taken away, but, quote, their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. For a season and a time. We would love to know how many years and days that equals. And throughout history, people have tried to sort of pin dates to some of these things, but we just don't have that information. It's not there. What we get a sense of is that the lives of these beasts are prolonged for some length of time, and that their lives are prolonged because of God's choice to do so. But God doesn't share with us exactly for how long this will be. It's true, it's accurate, but it's not precise. And both of those, right, the sort of trying to figure out how far to take the analogy and to sort of try to understand what the time and timing is all about in these stories, both of these preserve some of the mystery of the things of God that are ultimately beyond our comprehension. Now, the apocalyptic writing is a revelation from God. But just like in other places in the Bible, God reveals something, and maybe even many things, but not everything. So there's always some mystery there about the things of God that humans will never understand on this side of eternity. The second thing to keep in mind as we read this apocalyptic literature is that apocalyptic literature is written to impart understanding and to evoke feelings. Now, I think in the Western world, we think a lot about the understanding. What does this mean? But the real world reference, the thing that this means, isn't always the most important thing that Daniel's trying to convey. So images evoke powerful feelings in readers. So there are some places where Daniel's main point is not to try to help us understand what this means, but to help us feel a certain way. And because much of the imagery that Daniel's going to use reflects common motifs that were kind of in the water in the ancient world, or were in the broader literature of the time, the people who first heard Daniel or first read Daniel would have had a more immediate understanding of the images, and the feelings would have been potent and natural in them. So sometimes, so the point is that sometimes the image of the apocalyptic vision isn't trying to connect with a particular thing or person or event in the real world. It's simply trying to stir up a particular kind of feeling in us as readers and hearers. For example, a feeling of fear, or a feeling of hope, or a feeling of comfort. And I want to pause for a minute just to kind of make sure that this is making sense, and to see if there's any questions. So first, is this making sense? You can just give me a thumbs up, or you can say, no, it's not making sense. And let me pause here and see if you've got any questions too. Go ahead and raise your hand, or just unmute yourself if you've got questions so far.
Makes sense.
Awesome. I'm such a good teacher. Yes, this is great. So let's keep going. One more thing before we read. There are several themes that we're going to encounter all throughout the second half of the book, and so I want to sort of share those with you right at the start here. And these are in no particular order. But so some of the themes that are going to show up in Daniel chapter 7 through 12. First is the horror of human evil, particularly as it's concentrated in the state. And by state, I mean the king and the kingdom, the emperor and the empire, that sort of governing structure over all of the land there in Daniel's time. The horror of human evil, particularly as embodied in the king or the emperor or the structure of the empire. The second major theme is the announcement of a specific time of deliverance. We're going to see this in chapter 8 really clearly. But again, time and timing in apocalyptic literature is so confusing and multi-layered that people over the centuries have tried to say, well, that's going to happen in 1384. And then 1384 comes around and they'll say, actually, we meant 1843. And then 1843 comes around and they'll say, we're not sure, but maybe it's 2019. And turns out it's 2020. We're kind of experiencing all the plagues now. But the point is, Daniel's going to talk about there is a specific time of deliverance, and yet here we are thousands of years later sort of wondering when that is, because there's a clear there's a clear mystery, let me say it that way, about time and timing in these books. Another major theme is repentance that leads to deliverance, right? So the people turning their lives and their hearts around, and that being one of the ways that they receive deliverance from God. The revelation that a cosmic war stands behind human conflict. This is really interesting. The first half of the book was all about things happening, and there's all sorts of things happening in the world. And what the second half of the book is going to try to illustrate is that things happening in the world aren't just things happening in the world. There are divine components to those that are helping to bring those about, or that are part of those battles. Another theme, the certainty of judgment for those who resist God and oppress his people. And finally, the equally certain truth that God's people, downtrodden in the present, will experience new life in the fullest sense. And each of these themes occurs in just about every one of the final chapters of Daniel. And we're going to start to see them take shape here in chapter 7, which is what we're going to do next. We're going to read chapter 7. We'll try to get through that tonight. I think we'll have time. And then I'll have you explore chapter 8 on your own this week. So chapter 7, we're going to break it up into some sections. The first section is the vision of the four beasts. It starts in verse 1 if you're reading from a Bible, but I've got it on the screen as well. So let's read this. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Now, let me pause there. There's the historical setting. We've talked about this. There's a change in kings from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar. But it's interesting because at the end of chapter 5, Belshazzar is the one who's defeated by Darius the Mede. And King Darius is then the one who throws Daniel into the lion's den. So here in chapter 7, we begin to get the understanding that the events of the book of Daniel aren't intended to be organized exactly sequentially on the timeline. And so let's keep going. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Prior to this, Daniel's been interpreting the dreams that other people have had. This one, though, is his own dream. And I'm going to read through the end. So pay attention to what you notice here. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being. And a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, arise, devour many bodies. After this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So that's the end of the first section here, the vision of the 4 beasts. And since we're together, and since we've got the ability to do so, let me hear what you noticed. It's a strange vision. So what did you notice? What stuck out to you? What was interesting? What raised questions? What felt funny? What'd you notice?
I noticed that he remembered it.
Yeah, good. Yeah. It's not like most dreams I have.
And wrote it down.
And wrote it down.
Good. Yeah. What else?
Sometimes we get up and we think, we can sort of remember that you had a dream, but then trying to piece it back together and remember doesn't happen too often.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't make a lot of sense.
This is Kathleen. It seemed like each beast got stranger and stranger.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is one of those things where it's speaking in images, right? And so the image, like we kind of get a sense. The first one is what? The first one was like a lion. We can picture a lion, but then it's got eagle's wings, and then the wings are plucked off. And then it was lifted up to the ground and stood on 2 feet. And so it gives us something that helps us have a picture in our mind, but it's unlike anything we've ever seen, right? What else did you notice?
The eagle with the lion with the eagle's wings reminded me of the Babylonian gates with the winged lions that I've seen in art books.
Good. Yep. We're going to see in a minute that lion with the wings is meant to symbolize the Babylonian Empire. Yeah. So that symbolism is right on, Joe. Other things that you noticed?
I don't remember hearing about bears much in the Bible.
Yeah. Bears are never, there's a bear that eats some kids in one of the prophetic books. There's not a lot of good things to be had with bears in the Bible. Okay, so here are some things for you that will be helpful to notice. First, the setting is by the sea. So this is in, verse 2. I, Daniel, in my vision by night, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So the sea this is one of those images that's meant to make us feel something. It's not so much that I don't think that Daniel's trying to say, like, remember the sea, remember, like the sea is supposed to mean something. I think the sea is supposed to make us feel something, a sense of danger, probably, because in the time of Daniel, the sea was a symbol of chaos and of destructive evil. So we're supposed to get the sense that these beasts coming up, or that the sea is here and the beasts are coming out of the sea, that they are coming out of the chaos, coming out of the evil. We know right from the start that these are not good beasts. And here we see the use of the number 4 comes up a couple of times. The 4 winds of heaven, the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea. The use of the number 4 is significant here. The 4 winds, I think, represent the 4 primary directions, north, south, east, and west. And therefore are meant to encompass and represent the whole earth. So in context, the use of the number 4, especially here when we're talking about the 4 winds, suggests worldwide opposition to God. And we'll see at the end that Daniel's troubled by this vision. And so if he sees evil monsters coming up out of the sea that represent the whole earth being in opposition to God, there's really, we get a sense for why this dream is so troubling for him. We'll talk about the 4 beasts later on. But the beasts in general, they're recognizable to a point, right? A lion, we know what a lion looks like, a bear, a leopard. We know what these things look like, but they aren't like any creatures in God's creation. And that's the point. These beasts are bizarre. They are mutants. They are perversions of what God intended for his creation. And as such, I think that they're meant not only to evoke horror in us, but also revulsion. We're supposed to know that this is not how they're supposed to be. We're supposed to be kind of in awe and horrified by what they look like, but also repulsed by them. Like, this is not how things are supposed to be. So let's keep reading. We'll pick up in verse 9. I'll read through and you let me, and then you see what you notice and we'll talk about it again. So this section is judgment before the Ancient One. As I watched, the thrones were set in place, and an Ancient One took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head pure like wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So let me throw it back to you. What'd you notice here? This is it's a shift in scene. So what'd you notice?
Judgment.
Judgment, yeah.
That's what it sounds like. It's like he's in front of God, or just because he's getting judged. Because one person gets devoured, and another person gets all this glory.
Yeah, good.
That's what I saw.
Thanks. What else? Do you notice?
You said thrones were set in place.
Yeah.
So it's worldwide leaders.
That's why the thrones have wheels.
Yeah, I heard that. What about the wheels?
Just gonna
Not
say.
just for impressiveness, splendor, or
Yeah, I mean it's like a sort of like a chariot throne or something, right? So it's a throne that can be ridden is what it seems to
oh, okay.
Had a river coming out from it too.
Yeah, so like right, so it's a thing like we can it starts with an image that we can kind of grasp, right? As I watched, thrones were set in place. Okay, so we're imagining kind of like the court of King Arthur or something, right? And an ancient one took his throne, right? So Gandalf gets up, right? So we imagine this old kind of very wise looking person took his throne. But then the image starts to get to sort of like, wait, what? His clothing was white as snow. We can get that. And his hair like pure wool. Okay, so he's got big fluffy hair, but then his throne was fiery flames, right? And then it starts to get, again, be this kind of very dramatic, very otherworldly thing. And that's exactly the point. So verse 9 is a transition verse. Daniel's vision transitions from seeing these beasts coming out of the sea and then now into something like a courtroom scene. So Tammy, when you're talking about judgment, that's exactly right. Like we're supposed to kind of think of this as a courtroom scene. The two main participants are human-like and clearly divine. So there's the ancient one and one like a human being. So they're two people who are human-like but very clearly divine. The first figure is the Ancient of Days. And this, to me, seems to be God, specifically in God's role as judge. The second figure is one like a human being, or some translations say one like a son of man. He's riding on a cloud chariot, which in the Old Testament, right, this would have been surprising for Daniel's original audience, because in the Old Testament, the only person allowed to ride on clouds is God. And we've already set God in his throne in this picture. So here comes somebody else riding on the clouds. Now, with our Christian imagination and our Christian background, we see who in this?
Son of God.
Jesus, right? We see this is clear Jesus imagery for us, but for folks in the Old Testament, they would have been like, who is this Son of Man? They'll later go on to describe him as the Messiah, which is what we do too. We just have a name to put to him, and that's Jesus. But cloud imagery associated with God or with the Lord's appearance is as old as Exodus, when the pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night led the people through the wilderness. And then in the tabernacle, God appeared at the cloud that was present in the Holy of Holies. So while it would have been strange for those first hearers, we know who this means. We know that the image of Christ is unmistakable here. He is God incarnate. And verse 14 essentially says the same thing about this one like a human being that Philippians chapter 2 says about Jesus. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Philippians 2 talks about every knee shall bow, right? It's the same story, just in different places. And so far then, in this first half of Daniel chapter 7, we're presented with two image clusters, right? On the one hand, we have these four beasts and this crazy horn that pops up and that speaks arrogantly, and those represent the depraved kingdoms of the earth. And then on the other hand, we see two human figures who represent the divine realm. And the vision not only describes the realms then of human evil and divine judgment, but begins to set up something we're going to see in the later chapters, which is this conflict between the two. The evil of the earthly realm is in conflict with the heavenly realm, but we know that there's a clear conclusion, because the basic message of the whole book is that God is in control. We know how it will ultimately turn out. One important thing to kind of notice is that chapter 7 turns the theological direction of the whole book of Daniel in kind of a dramatic and maybe even darker direction. The images that we've already begun to see and that we'll see in the rest of the book are those of struggle and warfare between the forces of evil and chaos and the heavens and the holy ones, right? So in the first half of Daniel, we saw all the kings who clearly represented the empire and clearly posed a danger to Daniel and his Jewish friends, but also had some redeeming qualities. That's all going to get wiped away in the second half of the book, and we're going to be shown the empires for what they really are, and as children of evil and chaos that are battling against the divine and the holy ones. So any hope that the Jewish hearers of these stories would have had in a change of foreign rulers has been abandoned at this point. And the evil empires are revealed for what they always have been, beasts who rise out of evil and chaos. So now let's finish the chapter. I'll go ahead and read through this last section, which is where Daniel's vision is interpreted. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants, right? So Daniel's asking for help to interpret the vision, to know what it means. He asks one of the heavenly attendants of these thrones, some sort of angelic figure, to ask him the truth concerning all of this. Basically, what does this mean? So he said, this angelic one, he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. As for these 4 great beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Right? So let's pause here. You probably have guessed this already, and I've alluded to it a couple of times, but the beasts in the vision represent kingdoms. And we've already seen this scheme of 4 kingdoms, one right after the other, earlier in the book, in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a statue with made of all these different things representing different kingdoms. And here again in chapter 7, there are 4 kingdoms. But I think this is also one of those places where the writing is meant to be true and accurate, but maybe not exactly precise, right? We have to decide how far to take this metaphor. So it's true and it's accurate. Yes, I know that. But I'm not sure how precise Daniel's trying to be here. Because even though the vision begins with what we can clearly believe is the Babylonian Empire. Joe talked about this imagery before. The lion with the wings was a Babylonian image, right? So we're supposed to see that this is the Babylonian Empire. But the multi-level imagery after that makes it hard to definitively pin historical identification on really any of the rest of the beasts, with the exception of maybe one. You know, the bear might be either Persia or Media. The third animal, the leopard with all the wings, right? That's a very fast, speedy thing with 4 heads. And this might be the Persian army that had 4 kings. Or it might be Alexander and the 4 generals who took over after his death. And so I think the point is that these images are so otherworldly, are so hard to pin down, that they resist one-to-one identification with exactly something happening in the real world. And so I'm not sure that Daniel's purpose is to write history in advance, so much as it is to make a theological statement about the conflict between human evil and God in heaven. So the 4-fold pattern, even if we can identify some historical, like true historical figures along the way, the 4-fold pattern simply informs us that evil kingdoms will succeed one another after one another after one another until the end of time, and that they will all be subject to God's judgment, which wins in the end. Let's keep going with verse 19. Then I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn, which came up to make room, for which 3 of them fell out, the horn that had eyes and a mouth, and that spoke arrogantly, and seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones, and was prevailing over them until the Ancient One came. Then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. This is what he said. As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred season and the law. And they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Here the account ends. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly terrified me, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter in mind. So Daniel is particularly interested in this fourth beast, which has a greater magnitude of destructive force than any of the others. But despite its strength, its 10 horns are soon overpowered by another one who comes later, this one who speaks arrogantly that he's talked about over and over. That one, that horn that ends up having eyes, that horn that's little but plucks out the other 3, the one that comes after the 10, that one horn that he seems to be focusing on, that one horn is one that we think we can identify with a specific historical figure, Antiochus IV. I mentioned him briefly in session 1, but verse 25 is all about him. He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law, and they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. It's talking about Antiochus IV. I'll put his name on here so you can see. But he is a historical figure who, his greatest accomplishment was how deeply and how terribly he persecuted the Jews. And so this is who they're talking about. This is one of those situations where things could not get worse for the people of Israel, for the Jewish people. And yet the message is that he is not in control. This man, this Antiochus IV, no matter how powerful he is not ultimately in control. And in fact, he will be first in line to be judged by God and will be put to death right there on the spot. And so while all of this, let me wrap up with this, while all of this historical contextual information is interesting to me, and maybe it's helpful for you, we can understand the basic message of this apocalyptic literature even without knowing and doing all this kind of research, because Daniel's vision is meant to teach God's people that although it looks as if the world is under the power of human evil running rampant, looks are deceiving. Let me say that again. Even though the world looks like it's under the power of human evil, looks are deceiving. Because the whole cycle of evil power after evil power after evil power will be broken by divine intervention. That comes in verse 26. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. Right? It comes in earlier too, where it's the people are being persecuted until the Holy One comes, right? On verse 22, until the Ancient One came. So no matter what evil or hardship is happening in the world, all of that cycle of bad things and evil will be broken by God, who will intervene in the world, who will make all things new. God sits in judgment over every evil power. God's kingdom, populated by God's holy people, will triumph not just in the end, but for eternity, forever and ever, is what it says here. So that's all I'm going to say tonight. But let me turn it to you again real quick to see if you've got final thoughts here on chapter 7. Make sure it's making sense first, but then also if you've got specific questions that are maybe rumbling around for you, raise your hand or just unmute yourself and let me know what you're thinking. First of all, is it making sense? Is what I'm saying making sense, or are y'all just staring at a screen right now?
No.
Oh, very good.
It's making sense. Okay.
Yeah.
It does make sense, and it's very comforting.
Yeah, it does.
Isn't that interesting, Joe? Like the comforting piece of it, right? So apocalyptic literature, we know that it's kind of about the end times, and we get a sense that there's doom and gloom about it. But it's written with all sorts of hope and joy, because like people of faith, the Israelites in this story, and for us today, like to know what the end is, maybe if we don't know when, but to know what the end is a source of hope and comfort. That's a good catch. What else did you notice? Or what else did you sort of reflecting as we close up?
I'm not really sure if this is going to make much sense, but while you were reading it and like just thinking at it right now, it kind of reminds me of Revelation.
Yeah.
Which is really weird because Daniel is nowhere near Revelation. And but like just everything that goes on in it, and just all of the like doom and gloom that you were just talking about reminds me of Revelation, and that's like really weird to me.
Yeah, that's good, Haley. The Revelation and Daniel are the only two books of the Bible that have apocalyptic literature in them. So there's like, yeah, that's the echoes are clear, and maybe weren't planned that way by the writers, but certainly by the Spirit.
Was this written around the time that Antiochus IV was coming into power? Because I'm wondering if people would recognize the reference and have comfort that this guy would be defeated as well.
Yeah, Debbie, that was you, Debbie, yeah? Yeah, that's one of the kind of textual questions that scholars still struggle with, right? And it goes back to the question of when was the book of Daniel written? Was it written all at once? Was it sort of old stories written down much after the fact? And so really the two kind of main options that scholars will talk about is that it's written in the 6th century BC, when these stories of the fiery furnace and the lion's den are happening right then and there, and it's these apocalyptic chapters are prophecies about what's going to happen, and so they're predicting, and then later on the people will read it and understand that to be Antiochus IV. The other option that some scholars will say is that it's written during the time of Antiochus IV, and it's writing down these old stories of Daniel and his friends as heroes of the faith. And Daniel and his friends may have been writing in the 2nd century at the time of Antiochus and inserted themselves into these stories. We don't know. There's a lot. I mean, that's one of the main questions that I don't know that we will like have a definitive answer to this side of eternity. But it's one or the other, right? It's either Daniel predicting that this kind of leader will come up, and the people later interpret that to be Antiochus IV, or they're writing it during the time of Antiochus IV, and sort of with all the knowledge of God's previous provision to bring them through, knowing that this one will be defeated too. Okay, don't hesitate to send me questions if you've got them. Don't hesitate to pipe up in these last few minutes. But on your screen, you should be able to see this week underlined 4 things. Read chapter 8. You're going to see that there are some clear connections between chapter 8 and chapter 7, but there are some really important differences too. So read chapter 8. What do you notice? What do you think is important? You don't have, I mean, it's not, I'm not going to do a quiz. And there's no wrong answer, but what feels important and why does it feel important? Think about that, and then think about how chapter 8 is similar to chapter 7 and how it's different from chapter 7. So do some compare and contrast, and see kind of what comes out of that for you. Any questions before we go tonight? Man. Did y'all lose your chattiness, or do I just need to sign off and chat for a while?
I'm fine.
I'm just really tired tonight.
Wait, are you telling me that the world's got you down? Just remember, despite present circumstances, despite present appearances, God is in control.
God is in control.
Book of Daniel is perfectly timed for this.
Yeah. Very helpful to know.
Yeah.
Well, let me pray, and then we can chat for a little bit, or we can just say our goodbyes. So let's pray. God, we're grateful for the people gathered in this meeting. We're grateful for some time to set aside and explore your word together. God, we love to learn about it because we know that in the scriptures we meet you. And God, we love you, and we know you love us. And we pray, Lord, that you would help us to express your love for us and for other people in everything we do. God, we pray that we might just be so filled up with your love and grace that it overflows to everyone we meet. And God, we know that these are particularly challenging times in our world, here in the United States and all over the globe. And so, God, we pray that you would give us faith to trust and to know deeply that despite present circumstances, you indeed are in control. So God, give us the faith to believe that and the courage to live like it. We pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you tomorrow night for a communion service at 7 p.m. or I'll see you Sunday for worship at 9 or 11.
All right.
See y'all.
Or both.
Or both. Or I'll see you some other time. I don't know. We'll see. I'll see you when I see you.
Bye-bye.
Good night,
Good.
everybody.
Guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys Sunday.
That doesn't show.
I gotta go to work tomorrow. So I'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
See you guys Sunday.
Bye-bye.